The tractor had not moved in 11 years. The Oliver 88 sat in the far corner of the equipment yard at Delverton Farm, east of Millhaven, Calhoun County, Iowa. What remained of the tarp barely covered the hood. The rest had given out 1 grommet at a time, leaving the drawbar and rear axle open to 11 winters. Walter Breck walked past it every morning. He was 71 years old, had farmed the same 280 acres in Calhoun County since 1959. For 22 of those years, the Oliver 88 had been the machine he trusted most. Narrow turning radius, reliable power, not flashy, not complicated, just a tractor that started when you told it to and pulled what you put behind it. It stopped starting in the spring of 1979. Cold March morning, Walter had climbed up, turned the key, and gotten nothing, not even a cough. Not the low, reluctant grinding of a weak battery trying, just silence and the smell of cold iron and oil. He tried 3 times that week, same result. By April, Dale Vonbro from Millhaven Implement had driven out to look at it. Dale was 44 then and had been servicing farm equipment in Calhoun County for 18 years. He spent 40 minutes on the Oliver, checked the magneto, checked the carburetor float, pulled the head and looked at the valves. Came back to where Walter was standing by the fence and told him the cylinder, Walls, had scored. Told him compression was gone in 3 of the 6 cylinders. Told him a proper rebuild would run more than the machine was worth. Dale drove back to town, left Walter standing by the fence. Walter pulled the tractor to the far corner of the yard that same afternoon, covered it with the tarp, bought a used International 656 from a farm auction in Pocahontas County 6 weeks later for $2,100. The International served him well enough. It was not the same. 11 years went by. 40 acres of corn in 1980. 35 of soybeans in 1981. Wet summer in 1983 that cost him the South Field. Drought in 1988 that turned August into a month he didn't talk about. The International held up through all of it. The Oliver sat under its ruined tarp and became part of the yard the way old equipment does. Present but unacknowledged. His son Gerald mentioned it in the fall of 1989. Gerald was 38 then, drove up from Des Moines twice a year to check on Walter more than to help with farming. He suggested the Oliver might bring something at auction, said there was a collector market developing for Oliver tractors. Had read an article about it somewhere. Walter told him he'd think about it, didn't think about it. His neighbor Harlan Peck came by in March of 1990. Harlan farmed 160 acres to the north and had a habit of arriving around mid-morning with no stated purpose. He stood looking at the corner of the yard where the Oliver sat. The tarp had peeled back further. The full hood and left fender were exposed. The red paint had faded to a dull orange on the parts that caught weather. The chrome on the radiator cap had gone to rust. Harlan said it was a shame. That was all. Walked back to his truck. Walter stood in the yard after Harlan left. He stood there longer than he had planned. Saturday morning, March 17, 1990. Walter walked to the far corner of the equipment yard. He pulled what remained of the tarp off the Oliver 88. The canvas tore in 2 places when he folded it. He set the pieces on the ground and walked around the tractor once. The rear tires had held air better than expected. Left side at roughly 20 pounds per square inch. Right side closer to 12. The front tires were flat, both of them. The seat cushion had split open. The foam compressed to 1/4 of its original thickness. The paint on the left rear fender had oxidized down to bare primer. A patch roughly the size of a dinner plate. He climbed up and sat in the seat anyway. The steering wheel was cold through his work gloves. The key was still in the ignition. It had been there for 11 years. He did not try to start it. He climbed back down and went to the shop. What Walter Breck understood, what Dale Vonbro had not considered, was this. Walter had been present for every hour that machine had ever worked. He had rebuilt the carburetor himself in 1967. He had replaced the governor spring in 1971. He had replaced 2 head gaskets over 22 years, once in 1964, once in 1973. Both times he had read the scoring patterns on the old gaskets. They told him where the engine ran lean. He knew what a strong idle sounded like coming off that straight 6. He knew how it differed from an idle masking something wrong. Dale Vonbro had spent 40 minutes on it. Walter had spent 22 years. The shop was a poured concrete building, 40 by 24 feet. Walter had built it in 1966 with his father-in-law and 1 hired man. The south wall had a Craftsman tool chest, 8 drawers, purchased from a hardware store in Fort Dodge in 1969. Still had the original casters. The chest held tools accumulated over 31 years, some inherited, some purchased, a few traded for. He knew where everything was without looking. He spent the first hour that Saturday on the fuel system. He drained the tank, which held about a quart of varnished residue that had once been gasoline, the color of old amber, the smell of lacquer thinner and old engine oil. He flushed the tank with fresh solvent, pulled the sediment bowl, and found it packed with rust scale and a waxy deposit. Deteriorated fuel line, gone brittle from years of nothing moving through it. He cleaned it with a stiff brush and mineral spirits. He replaced the fuel line from tank to carburetor. New rubber line from a spool he kept for irrigation pump work. The carburetor came off next. It was a Marvel Schebler TSX standard on the 88. Walter had rebuilt one before. He pulled the float and found a small puncture in the lower chamber. The float had sunk and was holding fuel instead of floating on it. The needle seat had a groove worn into it. He ordered parts from an agricultural supply catalog in Clarion, Iowa. A complete rebuild kit, $8.40, arrived in 4 days. He put the carburetor back together on the following Thursday evening. Used a magnifying glass for the needle seat. Took 90 minutes total. He had done it faster in 1967. His hands were not as certain as they had been. They were certain enough. The magneto was the next question. Dale had checked it and said nothing specific was wrong. Walter took that to mean functional but weak. He pulled it on Friday. The points had a gap of roughly 12 thousandths. Should have been 16. He filed and reset them. Checked the condenser with a meter borrowed from Gerald's old electronics kit. Adequate. The rotor showed some pitting on the contact points. He cleaned it with fine emery cloth, then rubbed it with a pencil eraser. The 1955 Oliver Corporation service manual specified that method. He still had the manual in the shop. Its pages were stiff and brown at the edges. The cylinder compression was the question Dale had used to close the discussion entirely. 3 cylinders below spec. Scored walls. Not worth rebuilding. Walter had not disagreed with the diagnosis in 1979. He disagreed with the conclusion. He borrowed a bore gauge from Harlan Peck on a Saturday morning in early April. Spent 2 hours measuring each cylinder at 3 depths. The scoring Dale had mentioned was real. 2 cylinders showed consistent wear in the middle third of the stroke. One showed a scratch along the thrust wall, probably debris through the air cleaner at some point. None of it was catastrophic. Scored walls could hold compression with the right rings. The question was whether the existing rings still had tension. He pulled the head on April 19, 1990. The head gasket came off in 3 pieces. That told him it had been failing for some time before the tractor stopped in 1979. Possibly the reason it stopped. The piston crowns were carbon but not damaged. The valves were tight in their guides, but they moved. He lapped them by hand with valve grinding compound and a wooden dowel wrapped in cloth. It took 4 hours. He sat on a shop stool he'd had since 1971 and worked through it cylinder by cylinder. The rings he measured with a feeler gauge at mid-bore. End gaps ran between 14 thousandths and 22 thousandths. The service manual called for 10 to 20. 1 cylinder sat outside spec. He ordered rings for that cylinder alone from the same catalog in Clarion. $4.60. He put it back together on the last weekend of April. New head gasket, new intake manifold gaskets, new valve cover gasket. He torqued the head bolts to 95 foot-pounds in the sequence shown in the 1955 manual. Tightened them again the next morning after the metal had a chance to settle. He set the valve clearances with a feeler gauge. Intake at 12 thousandths, exhaust at 14. Consistent with the manual. Consistent with what he remembered from the 1973 job op. Total parts cost, $27.80. On the morning of May 3, 1990, Walter Breck connected a fresh battery to the Oliver 88. The battery was from the International, pulled and charged. He primed the carburetor with a shot of fresh fuel through the bowl vent, set the choke, did not pump the throttle, set it at 1/3 open. He turned the key. The Oliver 88 fired on the 3rd revolution of the starter. Not a cough, not a struggle, a clean start. The idle settled in at roughly 500 RPM within 20 seconds. It smoked briefly from the exhaust. Blue-gray, fresh oil run through the cylinders during reassembly. Then it cleared. He sat in the split seat and listened to that straight 6 idle for 5 minutes without touching anything. It sounded right. The particular sound of that engine under no load on a cold morning. A low, even note. Slightly mechanical. No miss, no flutter. Walter had not heard it in 11 years. He recognized it without effort. He let it run for 45 minutes. Checked for oil leaks. Found a small seep at the rear of the valve cover gasket. Tightened the 2 bolts there another half turn. The seep stopped. Harlan Peck came by at mid-morning. Saw the Oliver running from the road. Pulled in without being invited. Stood next to the tractor for a while. Didn't say anything specific. Watched the exhaust. Put his hand flat against the engine block and held it there. He drove home without saying anything about it. Walter used the Oliver 88 to disc the east field that afternoon. 18 acres. The ground was soft from April rain and the tractor pulled an 8-foot disc at full working depth without laboring. The compression held. The temperature gauge sat at normal. The oil pressure held steady at 40 pounds per square inch through 4 hours of work. He logged 180 acres behind that machine between May and October of 1990. It did not miss a day. The following spring, Dale Vanbrugh stopped at the farm on a Tuesday morning in late April. He was making rounds to farms that had bought equipment from Millhaven. Implement. He pulled in, saw the Oliver 88 parked near the shop, engine idling, walked over, looked at it for a moment, asked Walter what he'd done to it. Walter told him the carburetor, the magneto points, the rings on number 4, the head gasket, the valve lapping. Dale stood there, looked at the tractor for another moment, drove off. He sent a young man out from the shop 3 weeks later. The young man said his name was Kevin. Said Dale had mentioned the Oliver. Said Walter might show him the valve lapping process. Kevin was 22 years old and had been working at the shop for 2 years. Walter spent a Saturday morning going through it with him, start to finish. Why the head gasket pattern told you where the engine was running lean. How the valve grinding compound worked when you used too much versus too little. What the feeler gauge was actually measuring and why it mattered. The young man took notes in a small spiral notebook, asked careful questions. Stayed until noon. Dale Vanbrugh never mentioned the 1979 diagnosis, never referred to it. Walter didn't bring it up. Walter Breck farmed Delverton Farm until 1998. Handed the operation to Gerald that fall. Kept the house. The Oliver 88 stayed. Gerald tried to sell it in 2001. Walter told him not to. Gerald listed it anyway in the spring of 2002 in the Calhoun County Shopper, $3,200. No sale. He tried again at $2,800 the following spring. Walter bought it back himself for $2,800, paid Gerald from a savings account, parked it in the shop. He was 83 years old. He drove it once that summer around the perimeter of the east field just to make certain everything still held. Compression, temperature, oil pressure, everything held. Walter Breck died in February of 2007. Gerald found the 1955 Oliver service manual on the workbench in the shop, open to the valve clearance specification page. A feeler gauge was lying across it. Walter had put masking tape on 2 of the blades, written the intake and exhaust specs in permanent marker. The handwriting had grown careful with age. Gerald kept the manual. He kept the feeler gauge. He put the Oliver 88 back in the same corner of the equipment yard, the corner where Walter had found it in 1990. No tarp this time. It starts on the second key turn, still does.